sometimes for minor, almost insignificant reasons. But they touch deep-seated passions and hurts which have been there for generations. These things must be addressed, and they must be addressed frankly and openly. In a democratic society, the powers that the citizen has are basically economic power, political power, and social power. As an African people here in the United States, Booker T. Washington, post-slavery, tried to show us the way to an independent economic power so that we could have our own businesses, our own jobs, employ each other, take care of the needs of our communities within the larger economy of the United States. There were those who did not see it that way, and they won out. They felt that the best way for African Americans to progress was through the so-called talented 10th. And that talented 10%, if they were accepted by the major community, then they would be able to somehow transform the 90%. Well, I think we know that doesn't work. And I think we're celebrating Zuccotti Park today, and we see that the 99% doesn't appreciate the 1%, or the 90% doesn't appreciate the 10%, because it doesn't trickle down. And if one looks at the African American community at the present time, one will see that the average African American has 1/10 of the wealth of the average white American. Unemployment is twice as high, at least, in the black community. And we see that 50% of those in jail are African Americans. That means that something is wrong within the country itself, and certainly within the economic system, in terms of our ability to deal and move ourselves out of poverty. If one looks at the political system, we can see that we've made great progress, and that has been mentioned. We certainly have an African American president. And we have more than 40 members of Congress. We have over 500 African American mayors representing 50 million people, etc. One of the things that we don't have is a way to mobilize and to utilize that political power effectively, bearing in mind that economic power and political power equal social power. And social power is what allows you to move freely within the society without coercion. We, as African Americans, need to reorder those three areas so that they balance out. Obviously, we can't change our economics overnight, certainly not at this point in terms of the system. But what we can do is transform the political system, and we can also transform the social system. Because what has happened, because of our social and subsequently political efforts, we were able to make changes, 1964, 1965, in terms of civil rights, in terms of voting rights, and in terms of things such as affirmative action. so that there have been opportunities for many. Some were able to walk through the door in terms of those opportunities. And we have within the black community a major divide between the middle class, which has grown, and between the impoverished, who still remain impoverished, and that's also growing. It's interesting that Bob Herbert, who was a writer, was an op-ed person for the New York Times, interviewed James Farmer in 1995 and asked him to reflect on the civil rights movement and what had happened since then, in the 60s. And he said, we had great successes, but we thought that integration was the same thing as racism, and that once you achieved or had integration, that would be the end of racism. And he said the other thing we had, while we were having all these victories, we never had a plan. And I think that's a very, very telling comment coming from James Farmer, who was one of the big four at that time. I won't go into that history. We never had a plan. And I think that translates to today, that we still don't have a plan. We still don't have a cohesive plan of how we're going to use our political power, our economic power to advance our social power. Mel Foote is to be congratulated for what he's doing year after year, and I think he's becoming more and more effective. We need coalition, not just with the Congressional Black Caucus, not just with the mayors, but certainly with think tanks, historically black colleges, other agencies. We need coalition partners. Certainly we can go to Zuccotti Park and get people who are as disenchanted with the economic system as we are, as African Americans. We need to build those type of coalitions, but we need to do it in an organizational way. And certainly we look at the Tea Party and whether we agree with their philosophies or lack of philosophies or whatever you want to call it, they've become a significant force in a short period of time. And why is that? Because they had a philosophy that they believed in. And they were able to go out and operationalize that philosophy. And then they came to Congress with however many new representatives they had, and essentially take over the Republican Party. Well, what is our vision? What is our intentionality as African American people? This is what we need to operationalize to bring about the African Renaissance, to bring us to equality within these United States. And many people have been mentioned, Sullivan, Randall Robinson, Martin Luther King, Foreman, Young, all of those folks. And of course, I think we can add Mel Foote to that long list of people who have been out there working hard. But it's lonely. I was going to copy out a quote from Randall Robinson in his last book before he left the United States of America. And, he basically sacrificed his life over and over again for the conditions in South Africa as well as in Haiti, influencing Bill Clinton to put Aristide back in power and so on. And he was worn out going up against the system, even though he had Trans-Africa, but that wasn't enough to sustain what he was trying to do, which is to transform America. Martin Luther King got killed when he was trying to transform America. And I think most of you know that America needs to be transformed. We're not exceptional unless we're exceptionally good. we have not been exceptionally good for a long, long, long time. We, as African Americans, I think, have that cross to bear to be in the forefront of transforming America. We need to transform it internally, and we need to transform it externally. Therefore, I think we have a significant role in shaping U.S. policies towards Africa, towards the rest of the world, and towards us as African Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garvey and Ambassador Stith. By the way, just a word of corroboration on your story about Secretary Colin Powell. A colleague of mine, former colleague of mine now passed away that many of you know well, Howard Wolpe, was special envoy for the Great Lakes region for Ambassador Clinton, for President Clinton. And I guess he held that post for 3.5 years. And he told me when we began working on, and of course he negotiated the Arusha Peace Accords. He was the American representative to be in the negotiations for the Arusha Peace Accords for Burundi and the Lusaka and then Sun City talks for the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he told me that when the Bush administration came in and Powell was Secretary of State, that Powell called him and asked him to come into his office and brief him on all of that. It was the first time in those 3.5 years he'd been with the Secretary of State. Although he knew Madeleine Albright well personally, she had never asked him about anything he was doing. Interesting. Okay, we're going to open up for questions and comments. We've got a good 20 minutes to be able to do that. I think we've got a lot of meat here to chew over and things to think about. To remind you that we are being webcast live. So I'll recognize your hand and wait for the microphone to come so that the listening and viewing audience can hear you. And also identify yourselves. So the floor is open, right at the back there.
I'm Femi Akimbi, and I'm from Nigeria. I think it's an effort that is worth giving a lot of attention to. But my small suggestion on the issue of Dr. Julius Garvey is that there is a plan out there. I don't know if the rest of the African continent is able to put hand around it. There's a book out there by a Dr. Amos Wilson titled Blueprint for Black Power, a socio-economical imperative for African America for the 21st century. Mm-hmm. Anybody that have a chance to look at that book know that we have a plan. We're not just executing it. I'll stop right there.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Was that a question as to whether I've looked at the book? Was that the question?
No, I think he said. I think it was just a statement that it was a plan.
Oh, fine. Yes, I agree. I've read Amos Wilson, and he's very much a devotee of Marcus Messiah Garvey. Yes.
Okay, let's look for another question back here. Question or comments? Go ahead. Doesn't always have to have an answer.
Good afternoon. Howard Jeter, retired Foreign Service officer. How do you explain the Bush administration's position on Africa? Because if we assess fairly the accomplishments of that administration, they far surpass that of any other administration we've had in modern times on Africa. How do you explain it? Because I explain it not by using Condoleezza Rice or Colin Powell, but the faith-based community, which put enormous pressure on President Bush, to engage with Africa. I don't think he had any kind of predilection to do it, but when he started, I think everyone will agree that it's a big part of his legacy. So I'd just like to get your comments on that.
Let me start on the point of which you ended, Howard, and that is that there was no way to really anticipate where Bush would wind up relative to Africa. If you recall, when he ran for election, his first term, he ran as an unapologetic isolationist. I can recall during a couple of interviews where he was asked very directly two questions of paramount importance relative to foreign policy. One was about Israel and the Palestinians, and his response was, look, both camps have my phone number. They've been fighting for ages. After they sort it out, they can give me a call. And when asked specifically about Africa, his response during the first campaign was, there are some great people over there. We'll remember them in our prayers, but we have no strategic interest there. It was no way to really anticipate how far-reaching his policies would become relative to where he started as a candidate. I think there are several reasons that we saw this kind of a transformative policy agenda relative to Africa emerge out of the Bush administration. One to which I already spoke. I think that you can't discount the importance of having two African American secretaries of state, and as Steve commented in terms of Secretary Powell's interaction with Howard, to his being very strategic about visiting the Africa Bureau first, was a factor. I think another factor, undoubtedly, was 9/11. When it became very clear for geopolitical and strategic reasons, we were going to have to do a whole bunch of things differently and do them very quickly. Likewise, I would agree that the faith-based community had an impact on the Bush policy agenda as well. As a matter of fact, he said as much. Particularly is it related to PEPFAR. But when you look at initiatives like the Millennium Challenge Initiative, geared to enable the nascent democracies and the leadership in those democracies to pay a democracy dividend, it was a direct response to trying to deal or to mitigate a growth of weak and failed states. When you look at AFRICOM, it was clearly a response to an agenda. Because the USG is very clear about our strategic interests anytime we sit at the table, and quite frankly expect those with whom we sit at the table to be equally as clear about their interest.
Dr. Garvey, anything to add on that?
No,
question? Okay.
I'm not competent in that yet.
Okay, doke. Here, the one right up front here. Yep. Wait for the microphone and identify yourself. Yeah.
Testing 1 2 1 2. One.
You're
good.
okay.
You're good.
All right. Good afternoon, Dr. Garvey. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Everyone else, good afternoon. Thank you, the Wilson Center, Mr. McDonald, for organizing this. I am Ras Yahuda Edwards, representing His Excellency the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey Human Rights Foundation as a trustee. I am also coming out of the office of the Executive Secretariat of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League here in Washington, D.C. Again, thank you for showing up. I'm here with other members of the division, the juvenile.
The youth division.
The youth division, with their president and secretary and two, and with our ambassador here, Baba Oduno Tariq. Before I get into the specifics, I want to just, in parentheses, thank Brother Mel Foot also for his work to date. The question is, it seems as though in your presentation, you have surmised from then to now, which is the Tea Party, that is a case of organization, yes? I'm curious as to the chapter 22 of the Message to the People, the Course of African Philosophy by your father, Marcus Garvey. he lays out a 5-year plan. I'm suspecting it might have taken the Tea Party 5 years themselves. If I'm thinking you're familiar with the plan. 1914 to 2014 makes 100 years since the formation of the UNIA, of which the President General is the Honorable Cleophas Miller. Do you think at this juncture that, and do you believe, and do you have any knowing that this can still be done to date, and probably with even your help?
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your comments. I do appreciate where you're coming from, and clearly the Tea Party had more than simply the desire and organization. They had finances to bring about their transformation very quickly, and that's why we talked about the economic, political, and the social. Yes, Marcus Garvey's plan for Africa and Africans is still relevant and still important. Obviously, certain changes have to be made because history has moved on. Like you say, it's almost 200 years. 2014 will be 200 years. And part of what I said was that we need to reorganize those three sectors. One of the areas that we need to reorganize is that whole social sector, which means our mind. As you know, one of the things my father said, that we have to liberate our minds from mental slavery. And that's still our problem. Our intellectuals are being trained in a different mindset from what is needed from for African people to develop. And, I think it was Harold Cruz wrote about the crisis of the Negro intellectual a long time ago. And there's still that crisis because they don't understand the fundamental nature of Africa itself or of the American-European system, how it is unsustainable, and therefore one has to think and look outside the box for ways in which to change the system so that it can become sustainable, and we don't destroy the planet or the way in which we have lived for several thousand years. So we need a new paradigm, and I think really the new paradigm is based on an older paradigm where we look at each other as brothers and as sisters, and we cooperate with each other. We don't compete, and we share. We don't hoard, and we have compassion, and we don't oppress. Of course, it sounds almost like religion, but then it is religion. It's just that religion took the wrong turn. And it needs to be a way of life. And I call it African humanism. And I think that's what my father was advocating. And I think it's called Ubuntu in the Bantu language in South Africa. And in Haiti and with the Creole, I can't say the Creole that well, but it's all human beings are human beings. You see, and when you start from that, then it's not very difficult to work out a social system that honors all of us. But if you start from a premise that some human beings are better than others, then you'll constantly have us and them. You'll constantly have competition, you'll constantly have war, you'll constantly have chaos. And that's where we are, and we need a new paradigm. I'm not sure if I answered you, but...
Okay. All right. I saw right here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Vivian Lowry Derrick, and I'm with the Bridges Institute. And I thank you both for really outstanding presentations that make us think. And also thanks to Mel Foote for always being the catalyst. My question is about the role of North Africa. Because when we're thinking about the diaspora, we usually think about sub-Saharan Africa. And there's certainly been some ambivalence among North Africans in their views of the rest of the continent. And so, given the Arab Spring, how should we be thinking about their integration and particularly the constituency that they represent? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question.
I'll go first.
I'll let you go first.
Usually the guy that goes first gets the vote. I was hoping you would go first. It's the same business of who is the diaspora here? Immigrant Africans or those of us who have been here for a longer period of time, a couple of generations or what have you, and have gone through the slavery experience. As people do the same things, same thing with Africa. North of Sahara, south of the Sahara. Why? Because they want to divide Africa, because that's the way you conquer people. You divide and you emphasize differences and so on. Both Northern Africa, and the southern part of Africa have very, very similar histories that go way back in time, not only centuries, but indeed thousands of years, the trade routes and so on, and the interaction between North and South, trans-Saharan trade, etc. It goes way back. And the separation by those outside of Africa plays into prejudices that those within Africa would have, and it comes about from incursions into Africa by Arabs on the one hand and by Europeans on the other hand, who have created divisions as well as populations that are mixed or different from the original populations. I think Africa needs to be seen and needs to act as a geopolitical unit. And as you know, someone like Kwame Nkrumah, he saw all of Africa as Africa, and he moved in that way. Nasser at the time, as well as the Algerians over a long period of time, have always seen themselves as part of Africa. Muammar Gaddafi has always seen himself as a part of Africa, and that has been one of his problems, perhaps with other North Africans or other ethnic groups in North Africa. So that there's constantly been that sort of war going on. The AU itself recognizes North Africa as simply North Africa, and it's one of the 5 areas in continental Africa. So that while there are some differences between North Africa, Africa south of the Sahara, it basically is one continent, and I think it has one geopolitical future. And those of us who are Pan-Africanists need to see it as one. You may look at China, for example, and think that Tibet is separate from China, or Han Chinese are different from another subset of ethnic Chinese, but China says that all of those are Chinese and will maintain those borders. And I think it's in Africa's interest to consider North Africa as part of Africa, and I think it is in our interest as diaspora and Africans to go along with that.
Pastor.
Thank you, Dr. Garvey. This point about how the continent sees itself is profoundly significant, and it's clearly got implications in terms of how the continent articulates its interest as a continent, and it also has profound implications, from the outside in as well. But as I thought about your comment, as much as the question implicit in it, a couple of things struck me as being rather profound as we think about how we engage North Africa and how we engage Sub-Saharan Africa. Is that there are some profound changes going on in both areas. I mean, in the Arab Spring and the events that precipitated the uprisings that we saw, I've argued in another context that what we were witnessing was a response to an accountability gap. Those who were governing, those who were being governed, had no constitutional, or institutional way to hold leadership accountable. And so we saw this uprising to try to build more accountability into the public life of those countries that were affected. Interestingly, you've got something going on at the other end of the spectrum that is potentially as unsettling in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's what I call an expectations gap. We track 16 countries on the continent. They're in every region, west, the southern part of the continent, the eastern part of the continent as well. And the 16 countries we track have several things in common, which is why we track them as a whole. One is that there is some commitment to democratic governance and a willingness to go about the business of the country in a reasonably transparent way, and the leadership subjects themselves, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but they have to stand for election. Those 16 countries are also trying to organize their economies around free market lines because they've come to the decision, and I think rightly so, that it's certainly the quickest, if not the most efficient of the ways available to us to maximize options and opportunities. Now, when you look at those 16 countries, the good news is there's a lot of development going on. I mean, you'd look at a place like Dar es Salaam today, over against 10 years ago, which is a very short period of time. It looks dramatically different. Maputo, there's a robustness to the economy that wasn't there 10 years or so ago. Despite all of the trauma and tension being exposed in South Africa, when you look at where the country is today, particularly as it relates to the black majority, over against where they were in 1994, the progress is light years. And Ghana, you just go down the list. The kicker is this. When you ask what's the bad news, it's that a lot of development is going on. And the problem is that you've got this kind of unevenness now. 30 years ago, everybody in Tanzania was poor. And so it was a different kind of public conversation. Today, you've got people who started out maybe from the same village, and one has a house and a Benz, and the other guy's still on a bicycle. And so the question is, what happened to me? And as a result, and I'll take a place like Tanzania because I think it's particularly instructive when you look at a country like Tanzania, which is renowned for its stability and the sense of community that exists in its public life. In March, in response to an initiative driven by the opposition party, the president of Tanzania was forced to fire 8 key members of his cabinet. During Benham Mkpa's presidency, during Ali Hassan Mwinyi's presidency, and certainly during the presidency of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, that would have been unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable. There is a level of of consternation because of this unevenness in growth that is having profound implications. Now, and I'm going to close on this point, that one of the things that's also very interesting, if you look at the uprisings going on now, purportedly in response to this film, and you look at the composition of the crowd, it's mostly young men. And the reasons they are on the street are probably the complex, but let me tell you one that's pretty profound that we need to take note of, is I would bet that most of them don't have a job. And so how we engage, and now I'm going back to U.S. policy, how we engage regions of the world like that, where you have got disproportionately large numbers of young men without jobs. It's a recipe for stability. I've got 4 boys, and if I'd had 4 girls instead, I'd probably have all my hair.
Wouldn't that
Young men, testosterone and too much time is a prescription for disaster. And so we've got to begin to think about, and maybe this is a different way of thinking outside the box, but we've got to begin to think outside the box how we engage countries who have those sorts of issues, because again, weak states or failed states from the national security interests represent a problem because they're incubators for terrorists.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have to bring this session to a close because we've gone over our time, but keep your train of thought on the questions, because I think these matters will come again in the following panel. So don't be disappointed. Let's thank Dr. Garvey and Ambassador Stiff.
Yeah, okay, great.
And our next panelist, as soon as you see your name up here, come on up. I knew that was you down there. You're on the end.
Right there? Okay. All right.
Yeah, they're all on.
Good to see you.
Okay, thank you very much for your patience. We're moving right on because we have such limited time, and we made a tactical decision not to have a coffee break. I hope you forgive us for that, because we didn't think we could give us enough time for our presentations, because we really do want to get to them. I'm just going to quickly introduce the panel as I did the first speakers, and then let them speak in order. You do have their bios, of course, before you. First of all, we have Nasri Karu, who's the Managing Director for Public Affairs for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. We welcome Nasri. It's the first time to meet her, but very happy to have you here, both representing MCC and a member of the Diaspora. And then we have a good friend of mine, Moon Solfab, who's here today. He works on the Hill, but he's representing the Congressional African Staff Association, which is a group of Diaspora members who are working on the Hill and work on issues about Africa. And then we have Mel Foote, who needs no further introduction. Okay, Nasri.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thanks, Steve, for having me. As you mentioned, I'm Nasri. I manage public affairs for MCC. Diaspora outreach is one of my core responsibilities. I was raised in Sierra Leone, and like many members of the diaspora, that gives me a key insight into not only the challenges, but the opportunities in the continent. Before I go into who we are and what we do at MCC, I just want to give you some really quick sort of facts on MCC's involvement with Africa. Of the 26 MCC compacts signed to date, 15 are with African countries. MCC compacts in Africa total over 5.8 billion, and that's about 70% of our portfolio. And our threshold program has about 160 million within the continent. The U.S. and its partners have done a lot in terms of reducing poverty around the world. I think the last panel sort of chatted a little bit about that. But at MCC, we also realized that we needed to be a little bit more creative about how we do it. Our unique model for partnering with developing countries is to reduce poverty through partnership. And I want to emphasize that word partnership and how important that is, we feel that is to effectiveness. Whether it is partnering with the private sector, other development agencies, foundations, NGOs, or with the diaspora community, we feel like strategic alliances with non-governmental change makers are critical to leveraging development dollars, particularly in this fiscal climate. Again, tell you a little briefly about MCC. We are a relatively new agency. We were created in 2004 during the Bush administration, and our policies and programs are based on development best practices. We have a very specific mission, and that is to reduce poverty through economic growth. MCC is based on the core principles of selectivity, country ownership, transparency, and results. Our investments take the form of 5-year programs, which we call compacts. These are grants, they are not loans. These grants are intended to be transformative to a country's economy. The total grant is about $430 million. So far, we've invested about $9 billion in about 26 countries around the world, and we expect $13 billion in additional income for our partner countries over the next 20 years. We invest in all kinds of projects, from primary education to large infrastructure, but about 70% of our investments are centered in transportation, agriculture, engineering. MCC is a key player in the Obama administration also. Some of you may know, 2010, the president announced his new global development policy, which are built on MCC's core tenets and the principles that we've spent the last 7 years perfecting. I mentioned our 4 key principles, and let me start with the principle of selectivity, and I think some of these terms will actually relate back to a conversation from the last panel. MCC works with a small group of high-performing countries, selected through a competitive selection process. This selectivity is based on a country's policy performance in 3 key areas: economic freedom, investments in people, and ruling justly. We use a series of 20 independent data indicators to assess that policy performance. And one of the most exciting things about this is that everything is completely transparent. We publish all of the data on the website for every country that falls within the low income and low middle income categories. And that means that when we get a question about why a country didn't qualify for MCC, we can simply point to the website and you'll see exactly where that person is in terms of our scorecard. This is actually an area in which we believe civil society and diaspora groups can play an important role, and my office does a lot in terms of outreach around this. If the home country doesn't qualify for MCC assistance, we ask diaspora to hold them responsible for meeting those indicators and for pushing them towards qualification. I also mentioned country ownership. We require our partner countries to consult with civil society and the private sector in order to ensure that their proposed projects target their country's real constraints to economic growth. And that's done before we sign that check. Then we require partner countries to implement the grant programs themselves, creating jobs for a lot of the unemployed youth within those countries. These programs are truly owned by our partner countries, and that's one of the unique aspects of the model. Our goal is to move countries away from aid dependence and towards sustainable economic growth. Then MCC provides oversight and technical assistance during program implementation. But there's an active role for diaspora and civil society here as well, which brings me to the principle of transparency. Transparency and accountability are essential to effective development assistance. I think we can all agree. We're transparent and we expect our partners to also be transparent. In fact, our policies mandate that partner countries must be transparent, not only in terms of funding, contract spending, but also in their program status and in their management. We've built transparency into our model so that members of civil society, including diaspora groups, can hold their governments accountable for achieving success. We hope civil society will take this responsibility seriously, pay attention to government's public disclosures, and take them to task when they're not holding up their side of the bargain. At MCC, we also focus on results. Our distinctive approach to development has produced promising results for our partner countries, and we have a system to measure and to also report those results of our work. We make a point of broadly sharing our lessons learned, both good and bad, and interestingly, this actually happens less frequently in the development community than you might think. We consider ourselves to be a learning institution, and we make that real by proactively reaching out and working to integrate those lessons into our policies and all our programs. At MCC, we value the creativity and determination in diaspora communities, and we know, and my office knows, and I know that diaspora groups are a powerful position to affect change. And that brings me back to the topic of partnerships. As an organization that values open discussion and innovative ideas, we are eager to engage with civil society and diaspora organizations. So let me conclude by mentioning a couple of examples of how we work with diaspora communities. Procurement. As I mentioned before, our projects generate bids worth more than $1 billion annually, many of them in construction and agriculture and engineering. And these are very tangible opportunities, and some folks from the diaspora have already taken advantage of that. But these are tangible opportunities for individuals and businesses with ties to diaspora communities to get directly involved with projects in their home countries. MCC.gov has all of that information. Another way is by making follow-on investments. In collaboration with our partner countries, we're building ports, we're building roads, bridges, airports, and energy and irrigation infrastructure. And more than that, our partner countries are committed to significant policy reform to create a pro-business environment that will attract not only international business, but local and regional investors. No one is better positioned to benefit from this and to keep the economic momentum going, we believe, than the diaspora. They know their home countries, they know the culture, they know the environment, and they definitely know the needs of the market. And lastly, we're committed to strengthening our relationship with the diaspora through real-time information sharing. In addition to the wealth of information found on our website, we also provide multiple forums, such as post-compact investment conferences and other events where diaspora communities, community leaders, country representatives, and other interested parties can have an interactive dialogue with our CEO and our senior officials. In fact, next week during the General Assembly, we're going to host a small Benin investment forum with the President of Benin and some key investors. As I mentioned earlier, we do recognize the importance of diaspora communities, and my office is committed to expanding and to strengthening the diaspora network. I'm confident there are a lot of really good partners in this room, some folks we already work with. But what we want to do, our mission is to further enhance the connection between diaspora and effective development policies, not only in our post-compact investments, but also in the policies of their home countries and how MCC interacts with our partner countries. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Nasiri. Moon, if you will.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much. And Swahili, I'll say habari. So basically, the Congressional African Staff Association that Steve mentioned, we're actually a group of African Americans or Africans who immigrated here or been born here, first generation Africans who actually work in Congress. Obviously, we come from very different different parts of Africa. Originally I'm of North Sudan, and many of us actually hail from West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. And actually, somebody mentioned about the role of North Africa. We actually have or had a member from Egypt who can trace that. So we do look at the continent as a whole, even though I think specifically, if you look at the State Department designation of how it breaks up the region, it does look at Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa tend to be actually embedded with the rest of the Middle East on the Asian part. But we're an organization has been around for almost 3 years, and we've had a really quite successful run. We're only 30 staffers who do and work in different functions within the Senate and the House. But our passion and love of Africa and culture and our connection to the diaspora community that we come when we hail from actually probably adds an element to what we do. A lot of people might question if we are trying to in any way have an influence or coerce policy, but I think our main interest when we actually try to form this association is to promote good stories about the African continent. I think Africa has been, in many ways and for many decades, has been only having, as you all know, just about imbued with war and tragedy and famine and so on. But for me, for instance, as someone who's been on the Hill over a decade, I go back to my communities. I try to energize them to be much more integrated in the American system, try to energize them to be actually part of the American story and how to change the narrative, and to be part of the civic engagement. So I talk to the youth. I try to provide them with programs of how to actually intern in an office, how to seek, and how to be actually part of the campaigns. We are now, our association has grown. We've been able to successfully do a few programs on the Hill, along with many members from the subcommittee of in Africa. And that is, for instance, we started in 2010. We've hosted the entire Senegalese cabinet, former President Abdoulaye Wade from Senegal. He came in and we celebrated and passed it, along with many members of the House of Representatives, the resolution celebrating the liberation of many of the African countries after and during the independence days in the 60s and the 70s. We've also highlighted some of the issues. For instance, as I said, I'm Sudanese, so obviously an issue of Sudan actually comes to fore. So I've been very active on that and trying to highlight and to see, for instance, the issue of Darfur or the issue of the North and South with my colleagues, and to try to see what actually an organization, what sort of an information. Because if you look at the Congress and any way of civic activity, Congress depends on three elements, and I think what we call ethnic activism. And that, number one, it comes from basically framing the debate. That is something very important, is how the ethnic diaspora organization can actually frame the debate. And if you look at the Save Darfur movement, they actually framed the debate. It did not come actually from a policymakers. It's something that actually was a civic movement. The second thing is actually a lot of the members in Congress will depend on the information that comes from many communities. If you look at for instance, the Armenian community was actually brought up an issue that actually was dear to them. They're a small community, but they were all united, and they brought up an issue of, and that was important to them. Whether we agree on that, but that's something that they actually brought up. This third element that I see that the communities of the diaspora community can is the issue of oversight. If a policy or there's actually something on the floor, the communities that actually, if they see something that is not necessarily going the way they think it's actually best to serve the host country they actually hear from, they can actually contact that member and actually, and be more of an advisory role. Many of the diaspora communities, especially the first generation, they're not very much integrated, or they know how the political system. I mean, we have an excellent pluralistic system of activism here, and it makes it very open. But a lot of the diaspora in the past has not been able to actually realize how to energize. Many their effort was centralized. And I think the challenge actually also comes in is, as we see, as much as great and the wealth that the African diaspora community can actually bring up, but I think their goals and intentions tend to be not necessarily all in the same boat. The different communities have different needs, or they have different objectives or different goals. These are some of the challenges that we've noticed. But there's a lot of issues that actually I think many of us can bring up, and we've brought up, for instance, issues with the DRC or issues of Somalia, and how to discuss it. We've had Somalis in our group who actually are trying to highlight that issue and try to bring up the debate why Somalia has never been actually on the floor. And these are some of the things that we actually on the Hill. That we would like to actually bring up to the attention to our members, or to those who work on the committees that actually do or should focus on these issues. I think it's the diaspora, the last decades that I've noticed that, and I'm glad to see it coming up as actually at the forefront, is that it was only focused, all the academics and all the policymakers were just focusing on, if you look at the World Bank, it's about the amount of money that's actually going from the West into the for instance, specifically into African continent, about almost $4.5 billion a year, which is a great great amount of money, but I think the issue is now starting to deal with human rights, democratic stabilization, education, and economic development. And I hope to hear your question soon. So thank you, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Mel.
Thank you. First, I want to congratulate you, Steve, for your openness to host this forum. I don't know if you've ever had a forum like this before here, but it seemed like you have an interesting...
I would imagine not. I imagine we never had quite such a
diverse
crowd of color in this building.
But I'm really pleased to see the young children here. You know,
yes, indeed.
It speaks to where we really need to be going with some of this stuff. But I run an organization called the Constituency for Africa. And as the name might imply, our mission is to build a constituency to support Africa. I grew up in the 60s and 70s at a time of a great social change and upheaval in the United States. And I grew up in the Black Power movement, you know. And when President Nixon said, love it or leave it, I left and joined the Peace Corps, went to Africa, went to Ethiopia, Eritrea. And it really was that kind of mindset. I'm leaving here, you know, and I'm going to Africa with a U.S. government program, the Peace Corps. And I worked in Africa 7 years, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, Horn of Africa. And, you know, my motivation was I didn't know what I was getting into. At that time, I thought I was going to Africa. I really was thinking Tarzan. I really was thinking to see some white man on the vines, you know, and I got to Ethiopia. I had my dashiki down to here, my afro out there, and I got off the plane in Addis Ababa, and they were wearing suits and ties. I was shocked. But you know, so I grew up at that time. And back then, which really wasn't a long time ago, we didn't have internet. So I didn't even know where, when I heard about I was going to Ethiopia, I thought Ethiopia was in the Middle East. I knew about the stories of Bethlehem and Jerusalem and Ethiopia. I said, I don't want to go to the Middle East. I finally found a map and saw that Ethiopia was in the heart of Africa. And, you know, it sounds kind of funny now, but that really is the mindset what we talk about back then. In building a constituency for Africa, we're 22 years old now, a little small organization, but we think we have a big footprint. Our mission is to build a base of support for Africa. We obviously are focused around African Americans, Americans of African descent. How do we galvanize our community to support Africa? The view is, how can we ask Irish and Jewish and Italians and other Americans to support Africa if we're not supporting Africa? And so a lot of our effort is aimed at galvanizing our community in this regard. I've always felt that I should be strategic. I grew up under C. Payne Lucas, the former president of AfriCare, who was my boss and mentor. I grew up at a time where Randall Robinson, who really, if it wasn't for Randall Robinson, Nelson Mandela would still be locked up. You know, I grew up under Leon Sullivan, who launched programs to take large numbers of African Americans to summits in Africa. And so that was my backdrop in growing up. And so I said, okay, where can I make my contribution? And everybody talked about, you know, Africa. There's no constituency to support Africa. And I would hear members of Congress who bemoaned the fact that, you know, when they go to Jewish communities, they want to know about Israel. When they go to Irish communities, they want to know about Ireland. But when they come to the black community, they want to know about affirmative action and welfare and issues that were germane to African Americans. So with that in mind is what I really set out to change that. And I knew there was a lot of Americans who cared about Africa. I knew there was a lot of African Americans who cared about Africa. But by and large, they were not connected. They were not informed correctly. And so there was no base of groundswell for support for Africa. Back then, I talked to Congressman Charlie Rango, and I told Mr. Rango, I said, you know, why don't we have something on Africa, brain trust? And he said, my people want to know about jobs and affirmative action. They don't care about Africa. But I've seen a great change since that point. I would say that I think there's a lot that we can do. I felt as an individual, as an individual person, there's a lot you can do to impact U.S. policy toward Africa if you can get yourself organized and promote it. I personally have been involved in a lot of this stuff. When we think back to the AGOA, you know, I was there at the beginning. You know, I was part of the brain trust that drove AGOA. I took it around the country in a series of town hall meetings and got people to weigh in on it. PEPFAR, you know, we know about President Bush signing off on a $15 billion initiative, but before PEPFAR, there was a program called the AIDS Marshall Plan that was led by my former chairman, Ron Dellums, and that went to the Leach-Lee bill. You know, it went to another level. Next thing you know, President Bush signs off on a $15 billion initiative. I can't take credit for it, but I'm happy it happened, but We see our footprints back at the early stages of that. I got the White House one time after the Rwanda genocide to give us Air Force Two and fly us a delegation of 40 of us to take an assessment of the situation. You know, here we are flying around on the White House plane, going to Rwanda and Burundi and places like that. I've been involved in Ethiopia during the war, doing shuttle diplomacy between Ethiopia and Eritrea to stop the war, the path to peace, and many other efforts that I could say, well, gee whiz, an individual actually could make a difference and actually could have something to say about this. I've seen the policy change dramatically over the years. When I came to Washington, Herman Cohen was Assistant Secretary for Africa. I think he was the last non-African American to serve in that post. You know, and since then you had George Moose, Connie Newman, Jindai Frazier. Now you got Ambassador Carson. Maybe I missed somebody. It's not that we own that position, but it's also a statement that we've actually, have progressed. And I've seen African Americans or Americans of African descent play tremendous roles. Now we got President Obama as the President of the United States of America. Now I can't take credit for that. I can't. But it speaks directly to what we're talking about here today, this diaspora. And here you got a guy with this name, Obama, Kenyan father, I mean, what do we have here? But also I'm seeing like Daniel Yohannes now running the Millennium Challenge account, an Ethiopian immigrant. I see Mimi Alamayo, Senior Vice President of OPEC. We didn't have African immigrants in these positions before, So we're seeing a lot of transformation. We're seeing a lot of progress. Congressman Donald Payne the late Congressman Donald Payne used to live in my building. We've done a lot of work together. Every morning before going off to work, I would slip stuff under his door. I saw the policy change by the stuff I slipped under his door. I've seen the policy change. I said, also Payne got this great idea. Yeah. So it just really, to me, it just means that we have a lot more power and influence as individuals even than we think, The challenges ahead, I think this week is our big week. We do a series of meetings under the name of Ronald H. Brown African Affairs Series. And this morning we had a briefing on the South Africa Diaspora Summit that took place in South Africa in May. And more than 60 countries were represented at that summit. It was absolutely historic. It was a chance to network with Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. African populations throughout the world are coming together in a profound kind of a way. It's a long way to go. I'm also an advisor, consultant, if you will, with the World Bank on their African Diaspora Initiative. And so I've had the chance to really leverage that big, onerous institution to actually push it more toward support for diaspora initiatives. And I think that it's moving on the right track. It's on the right train, but we got a long way to go. In terms of challenges, I look at South Africa. I'm glad to see the DCM from South Africa Embassy here. When I think about how African populations could change and transform policy, I think about South Africa and what you see in South Africa today compared to the time of apartheid. And, a tremendous transformation. And I think there's a lot of lessons for us to learn in that regard. One of the biggest problems that we have a lack of a black think tank. We don't have a Woodrow Wilson Center in the black community, And so oftentimes when we have a big, one time when AFRICOM first surfaced, I was asked to come over to the building over near the Pentagon. And you had to have all kinds of clearances to go up to the floors. And it was intimidating. So he finally got me up there to going through all kinds of rigmarole. And it was a group of senior corporate leaders to talk about AFRICOM. I still don't understand what that meeting was about. But I can say that they were asking me, what did I think about Africa? They had all these questions, and these guys didn't have a clue. But rather than have a thoughty, educated, informed view, I had to shoot from the hip, because there's no think tank to actually flesh out an African perspective on some of these critical issues that we're talking about. And so one of the challenges for us as a constituency is to develop the capacity to think, to analyze, to rationalize, and to really come up with some views that might be contrary to U.S. policy views, but can also offer insight into direction of U.S. policies. And then there's a whole lack of resources to mobilize, to educate. We know what to do. We know how to build a constituency to support Africa, no question about it. We know how to push the buttons. We know how to mobilize people out in Los Angeles and Chicago and Denver and elsewhere around the country. We have the knowledge. We know we have the connections. We know how to utilize the Congressional Black Caucus. We know how to utilize the National Black Caucus, the state legislators. We know how to get the black media involved. We know all that. We know how to link up to the HBCUs. but it's a lack of general resources to do it. So where do those resources come from? We would think they would come from an Oprah Winfrey type or say a wealth of entrepreneurs. They should come from African countries. I don't want to speak to some of these countries out in Africa, but some of the countries in Africa, you got wealthy entrepreneurs who could, boom, $5 million, and the diaspora, the constituency in the United States, which is the most powerful, here the most powerful city in the world we're sitting in right now. You would think that the African governments would say, gee whiz, how do we play in Washington? When I see how the Jewish government operates, they understand it, and they mobilize very well in Washington. But when it comes to Africa, I think it gets into a whole question of governance in Africa, how Africans see they need to pay money, welfare, grants, and this kind of thing, when in fact we should be organizing ourselves to take advantage and impact U.S. policy toward Africa. So having said that, I'm really thrilled to be here. I think the conversation is rich, germane. Dr. Julius Garvey is an icon. I'm not sure everybody knows about Marcus Garvey in this room, but Marcus Garvey is really the preeminent Pan-Africanist of all our time, and one of the people that, when you mention his name in the black community, especially in the Rasta community, and it's kind of you stand up and take a bow. But it's great to have my good friend Dr. Julius Garvey with us, who is rich in the literature, rich in the understanding of what needs to get done. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mel. And Mel, you reminded me of a dereliction of duty, because I did want to recognize Johnny McAtini, who I believe is our only diplomat present here from an African country. But yeah, that's right. I got it right. Sorry, John. Okay, it's open for questions. Very rich dialogue here, and one right in the middle there. Derek?
Thank you, Steve and Mel and Nasiri and everyone. My name is Nolu Crockett and Tonga. I'm with Strategic Partners. This is related to both panels. I mean, we have such a wealth of people even in this room. Give us an assignment. Tell us what to do. We're all fired up. We believe in our potential power, and we do need to get organized, as someone has said, in terms of a strategic plan. So you guys are the leaders. Give us an assignment. Tell us what you want us to do.
Okay, thank you, Nolu. Maybe we'll take a couple of more comments or questions. Okay, right there, and then down here, Derek.
My name is Mengistu. I'm a member of. My name is Mengistu. I'm a member of the Ethiopian diaspora community here in the United States. My first question is to my sister Nasri. You mentioned some important points about encouraging the diaspora to take part in the policy and project formulation in your organization. I have a concern. Some of the diaspora from Africa, particularly from Ethiopia, the majority of Ethiopians here against the government there. We are here in the first place because that regime is brutal. We cannot live there. Okay? So how do you harmonize our interest in the interest of that government over there? Because we're expected to shape the policy of our home country and the United States here. So there is a conflict between the diaspora and the government over there. And one of the criteria you mentioned is just rule or something like that. I think it has to do with good governance.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
This is a very sticky issue. Because I know there is duplicity in the U.S. foreign policy. Like they give blind eye, deaf ear, and democracy, human rights in some countries like Ethiopia. They don't care about it. They know everything. The State Department's human rights wing knows every brutal action, human rights abuse in Ethiopia. But at the same time, the United States considers Ethiopia as a major ally. So how do you harmonize this conflict? My second question is to my brother. We Ethiopians here, I can say we are very active in bringing out our issues, concerns to the United States Congress, to the State Department, and to the White House. We have been in the streets from time to time. We can stand number one on this issue, but we didn't get any result. Okay, there was one fruitful result which reached to the level of passing the Congress. I remember it was HR 2003. Yeah, but
Yeah, I
it
remember
died.
that.
Yeah, it died in the Senate because one, as I mentioned earlier, the foreign policy of the United States towards Ethiopia is myopic, and it ignores promotion of democracy at the expense of this fighting terrorism. And secondly, we are faced with a very huge lobby group paid by the region in Ethiopia. So how do you advise us to proceed in the future? Third question is for all of you. Because
That's got to be your last.
we consider Africa as a single country. We are saying the foreign policy of the United States towards Africa. Africa is a continent, over 53 countries. I hear some people from intellectuals to some candidates to the presidency saying, considering Africa as a country. So is it wise? Is it fruitful to discuss as if Africa is a one country and the United States can have a uniform foreign policy towards Africa? Thanks so much.
Okay, I think we'll let that be this round of questions because there was a lot there. And they were connected to what Nolu asked too. You know, give us an assignment because some of these is, what can we do? So Nasri, why don't you begin and everyone take it.
I'll actually answer your question first. The MCC is just one part of the U.S. government sort of foreign assistance machinery. I mean, there's USAID, there's State Department, there's sort of the NSS. I mean, there's Commerce, there's OPIC, there's PEPFAR. There's a broad array of it. Our model was actually geared towards selective countries, and we emphasize the word selective. I mentioned 20 indicators. Of those 20 indicators that we measure countries by, we're talking human rights. We just added a gender indicator last year. So countries are vying against each other in a very rigorous set of things that we're saying. If we're giving you this grant, for you to tell us what your constraint to economic growth is, you need to be committed to doing all of these things. And you need to show us that by these scorecards. And these are all independent scorecards. We've used the World Bank's indicators. I mean, we use Freedom House, so it's not stuff that we kind of go in and come up with those numbers. So I certainly hear what you're saying. We get a lot of comments from a lot of different diaspora about why their countries are not part of the MCC family. And you can see, again, by the scorecards, there are some countries that just will never qualify for an MCC. That doesn't mean that they don't get USAID funding. That doesn't mean that they don't get funding from other parts of the USG, which they do. We don't do humanitarian aid. They may be getting humanitarian aid, but for MCC, we really look at that. We have something that we call the MCC effect, that what we call the seal of approval. When you're part of the MCC family, what we've seen is that countries are actually getting a lot of more people to look at them, give them a second glance, to sit at the table. A lot of investors are looking because now they're seeing that there's an enabling pro-business environment, that it's not just programmatic, but it's also policy reform that countries are doing. We recently reinstated Malawi. So again, it's one of those things where we're looking to make sure that countries are ticking all the boxes. And the hope is the more countries will see that. And again, we're engaging diaspora to push their countries so they can meet those qualifications. Unfortunately, funding is as it is. We don't have enough money to go around. So at the end of the day, you look at how much you have and you look at the list of countries that are qualified, and we get to pick from there.
Is Ethiopia an MCC country?
No.
I didn't think so. Okay, no, we still had some more aspects to that question.
Well, you've brought up something that is, I know very well. Anyone that worked on the Hill or worked lobbying the Hill, you yourself probably seen it before. The dynamics of the U.S. foreign policy takes into the U.S. national interest first. And especially post 9/11, we're talking about security. So that plays a big dynamics. I'm not talking only about Ethiopia. I'm talking about a broad spectrum of, and the nexus of how that you can bridge the gap. We do care about human rights. We do care about democracy. But the United States was not going to go out there and force such. We try to highlight and we try to pass that. Your issue, as hard as it is, and no matter how you actually feel about a particular issue, I wouldn't stop. And you have to go and find, and my advice to you is you should find members in Congress who are sympathized to your, and believe me, they are there. If you need to reach out from you have a strong community in Atlanta. I know they're very strong Ethiopian presence in Atlanta, in LA. You have strong presence here in Maryland, in Virginia. You contact your representative and your congressman and your senator, and you highlight that as a constituent, this is how you feel about that. And believe me, we do in Congress. People do they do listen to their constituents. And the more you raise and the more you fundraise, and I just mentioned Darfur. Darfur, it's the constituents who I actually highlighted Darfur. No, it's not. It just didn't come out of the blue. It was a student movement. It turned out to be a successful movement to brought up an issue. So that would be my advice to you.
Mel?
Yeah, I want to add to this. What you can do. When I first came to Washington, I met some of the lobbyists, and I'm not going to mention their names, but I used to wonder why the African governments were hiring these lobbyists, who were largely white lobbyists, and giving them some incredible amounts of money, $30,000, $20,000 a month, whatever the number is. And so I would ask, I said, well, why is that? And they told me that, these countries, they feel like, they need a white man to talk to another white man. They're talking about the President of the United States. So that was the justification. So I said, okay, once you got, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, did the game change? Now you got Obama as the president, does the game change? I want to throw that out there. In terms of what you can do, the key thing, I think, is to educate yourself and your community about African issues. You got to educate. There's a lot of literature out there. Anybody who can't understand what's going on now, with the internet, allafrica.com. You got all kinds of stuff out there to give you information. So it's not a lack of information out there. It's a lack of us being receptive to it. So I commend people, first of all, to educate yourself about Africa and African issues. Another thing one could do is to certainly fund an organization like mine. When I look about our resource base and how we get our resources, it's actually pathetic. And there's a saying. We're talking slogans today. Freedom is not free. Freedom is not free. Never has been. Never will be. And so we're not going to fund our own institutions. It gets into the whole thing again. How are we going to help Africa? Why are we asking other people to help Africa if we're not prepared to help Africa ourselves? The same thing is true of our institutions, at whatever level, And I think we're going to get there. I personally think the transformation is going to be generational. I see a lot of young people now who are involved in Africa, doing African things on the Hill, and organizations like MCC, XM Bank, and all across the map, doing wonderful, wonderful. The young people got in. Some of them think they got in by themselves, and they didn't. The pressure got you in. The pressure, the lobbying got you in. I took on the World Bank last year. They had a report called the GAP report that talked about discrimination at the World Bank, and the percent of African Americans in the bank is 0.04% or something like that at any kind of a senior position. And they tried to deny it and all that, but it went all the way to the top. And the upshot of it is change is in the wind. All of a sudden, people are saying, well, gee, let's look at them. Now we're talking to the vice president. He's talking about, I need scientists and engineers. We got a forum going on right now over at Howard University of engineers and technical people, and it's packed up. And the World Bank is over there. The State Department is over there. So I think the transformation, some of this stuff is about let's do it and not just think about it. Once you think about what is your strategy. Now, what I try to do also, you got all kinds of African associations. Last week I was up in Philadelphia for the Ugandan North American Association, and they're one of the best organized of all the African associations. They're very good at organizing, but they don't have a strategy. They come together and they bring them together. They're okay with putting the dinner together, but if you say, okay, what is your strategy for the United States? They don't have a clue. And so I think that's where, as a diaspora here, you got like 7 categories of Africans in the United States. African Americans by far the largest, those who came by way of the belly of the slave ship. But then you got African immigrants who came by airplane. I'm sure you came by airplane, right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. First class.
And then you got like Africans who come from the Caribbean, you migrate. You got Africans from the Latin America. You got the children of African immigrants. Some of those children were born here. Their parents might be Nigerian, but they were born here, or Ethiopian, born here. They relate more toward here than they do back to the home country. And then you got Africans from the civil service, like the World Bank and the Diplomatic Corps and so forth. All of those groups think differently. They all have different agendas. They think completely. Yeah. If you think they're monolithic, you're missing something. But there is a need to harmonize the relationships, improve some cooperation, improve understanding. There's all kinds of programs for education for kids. There's all kinds of activities out there. So I try to put myself out as a consultant or as an advisor to some of these groups that are looking to be creative in terms of helping Africa.
Okay, thank you, Mel. I'll just pick up on one thing you said that I'm going to comment on, and that is educating our own communities. Because I think one of the challenges that we don't focus on enough is we always get stopped by the fact that American foreign policy is dictated by our own strategic interests. I think there needs to be a redefinition of our strategic interests as it applies to Africa. I think Africa needs to be much higher on the totem pole of priorities of strategic interests. But in any case, I had a question. I'm taking these in the order that I saw them back here, and we only have time for about 3 more. So I'm going to come down here and to here. And you're going to give the floor up. You're going to be. Okay, I saw you very early on. I didn't want you to think I. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Robin Sanders. I'm a former Foreign Service officer. And actually, my question is really for Mel and really a comment on the plan. One of the things that's a challenge is we have these disparate groups and we don't have a coalition base that brings all these groups together. So how would you encourage us to do that? One of the successes we had with all of the groups coming together was AGOA. It's a great example of how we got AGOA passed. We haven't done that since. And the other aspect on foreign policy that I'd just like to put on the table as a comment is that we have less diasporans and African Americans in the policy arena than we've had in previous years. Under the Bush administration, we had more African Americans in senior positions from the ambassadorial level to desk officers to office directors across the board. And that makes a difference because policy is not always generated from top down. It also generates if you're sitting around those interagency tables. And we don't have enough people sitting around those interagency tables to be able to put ideas and initiatives on the table that then germinate with coalition support and move forward to change policy. So how would you address those two things, and how can we come together as a community to make those things happen? That's the only way it's really going to change.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Greg?
I'm Greg Simpkins. I'm with the House Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health and Human Rights, and I want to take up Nolu's question and also the brother from Ethiopia. There are 2 things that you can do. One is to continue to inform those of us on the Hill, like Moon and myself, of situations in your country. The Ethiopians have done that. I've been working with Ethiopians for several years, and the legislation we came out with several years ago was because of those interactions. There are others throughout the diaspora, not just those from Africa, but those who work on Africa, like Nolu, who have been very helpful and should continue to be helpful in giving information to us. We have the Africa Subcommittee in the House and the Africa Subcommittee in the Senate, and we work together. We've had a series of meetings with the diplomatic corps, and we work together on legislation, on other initiatives, and it's very helpful for us to hear from you. The second thing is when we have these initiatives, it's important, as Moon will confirm, for you to support what we're doing, make phone calls, send letters. That all helps. When we got the African Growth and Opportunity Act passed, as Ambassador Sanders has said, it was because of that kind of support and pressure. And I think Ambassador Jeter talked earlier about the faith-based community. Very important in getting things done. Members of Congress don't take but a dozen or so calls to take notice of what you think is important. So those 2 things are what can be done, and they have been done, they're still being done, and they're still very important. So that's what I would tell you.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we've had a giving up of the floor here.
Thank you very much. I'm Johnny Muloto from the South African Embassy.
Johnny McAtini, who I know very well. I'm sorry, Johnny.
Johnny McAtini was one of the greatest multilateralists.
I know he was. I know him.
There you have it, yeah. Thanks, Mel, for all the good work that you do and all your great presentations. Just wanted to say that, just to echo your point, that a lot of it comes from education, really, about who we are in Africa. And to a large degree, us as diplomats have a role to play as well, to make sure that we support that education effort and to clear some of the stereotypes and misconceptions about our continent and all the wrongs that go there. I just wanted to pick up on the point that was not mentioned by any of the speakers about the recently published US-Africa strategy. And the role that the diaspora has played in that, because we didn't see or hear anything reflected out of that, whether you did have a role. I know that when the policy came out, at least some of us from the African community was astounded that, there wasn't really anything new or dramatic in the line of a strategy that said, what is it? It was really sort of like a summary of what has been going on over the past two administrations. So something that I thought I would hear your thoughts on that going forward. And Nazri, maybe at some other point we can have some conversations around that. It relates to the strategy as well. That it seems to me from what you have articulated, it's much more how Africa responds to a US fixed policy towards Africa. What you were saying was how the diaspora influences their own communities in Africa rather than how they impact on the MCC itself in terms of the compacts. I'm not sure if it's an evolutionary process or it's just fixed as it is, that these are the priorities from a US perspective, these are the strategic priorities or interests for the US, and Africa responds to that. And does that take into account the dynamics that evolve from the continent? But I know that this is something that is much more involved than that. It's something I would like to hear at some point how you handle that.
Okay, thank you, Johnny. Yeah, we are just about out of time, so what I'm going to do, starting with you, Mel, is just let you all take a few moments for a final comment, and you might want to pick up on Robin's question or Johnny's comments there, but anything you want to say?
Quickly, Robin asked a tough question here, and the organizing side is not easy, and those who try to do the organizing oftentimes get beat up, and I've been beat up many times, cut up, because you're trying to bring people together. There are forces out there in our community. Ego is a major factor out there. Who's the leader? Everybody want to be the leader, but very want to do the work of the leader. And I see it all the time where people are grabbing the microphone, but then when it comes time to do the hard organizing, to do the emails that go out and the late night work, they're nowhere to be seen. So that's a tough one. I would say, some say the Democratic administration is better on domestic policy and Republican administration better on foreign policy. During the Bush administration, my vice chair was Jack Kemp until he died, a well-known Republican. And I can say that for me, it was much easier. I mean, I can't think of any administration in the history of our country that did more for Africa than the Bush administration. Yet, if you asked President Bush to find Africa on a map, he would have been hard-pressed to do so. But what he did, Condoleezza Rice, African-American, but her expertise with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and that kind of thing. But what they did, they hired a very good expert on Africa to be the Assistant Secretary for Africa, Jendai Frazier, who all of us, Republican and Democrat, feel, she knows what she's talking about. And she was able to shape a policy. She was able to get the administration in line with it. They did some tremendous things. There wasn't a question of Democrat or Republican. The administration during the Bush administration, I mean, I can look back at the level of African American participation. It was remarkable, all up and down the line, including the ambassadorships in Africa, Nigeria, and South Africa, Zimbabwe, Benin, Ghana, name it. And these were not your typical African American. In the early days, when an African American did get into a policy position, they were either really, really in line with the majority opinion on everything. In other words, they were bought, And but what we saw in the Bush administration was very strong African Americans, strong on civil rights, strong on the whole range of it, but also knew what they were doing. I don't see that in the Obama administration. I see a president who knows Africa very well. I see a Secretary of State who's very committed toward Africa, but I don't see the depth and the breadth of decision making. You talk about the Africa policy, and I read it. I bought along with it because it's I'm a supporter of the administration, but it's not creative. It's not dynamic. I'm hoping that once the elections have passed, we'll have a chance to go back in and add some dynamism to them. But your perception about the policy, I think, is very correct.
Thank you, Steve. In closing, and I'll do this real short, Congress is, and I agree, Gregory put it perfectly right. This is not a very difficult, it is the people's house, in other words. Due to, unlike popular perception, actually, you don't have to actually meet with the member to get your stuff done. Actually, meeting with the legislator who's in charge of an issue will probably be more beneficial than meeting the member. The member probably has only give you 5 minutes because he has to worry about the next vote or the next bill or the next amendment. Getting someone like Gregory or his colleagues who work on issues that are related to Africa, human rights or democracy in Ethiopia, finding those key, and they're not really difficult to find. We'll be more than happy to reach out. And believe me, Ethiopia, and I know after the passing of Meles Zenawi, it is a big issue right now, and it's something that we are actually, and I think the United States is, and anyone in Africa is looking into. I wouldn't lose hope, and I hope that the next diaspora keeps much more engaging. Learn from other ethnic groups that actually have been able to be successful. There's so many of them, and I mentioned the Armenian, who are very small but yet very vibrant, very politically active, and have done a lot of great for their small country. And there are so many examples of that. The Turkish American Alliance organizations as well, and that's a big NATO ally. So I will take these into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasiri.
I'd love to chat a little later with you, but one thing that I will say is, country ownership is sort of the foundation of the model, and it certainly isn't MCC's sort of strategies to the countries. We basically the countries tell us what their programs are. And what we found is that a lot of countries tap their diaspora, as you mentioned. I mean, you have a wealth of information out there. You have a well-educated diaspora across the continent in all levels of works. And so you find a lot of countries will tap people from the World Bank, from Deloitte, to come in to pull together this MCC compact. And that's a core way where people can put their expertise, from engineering to agribusiness to anything that they have in terms of that part of it. And the President's Africa strategy, I will tell you that one good thing that came out of it is the fact that it is requiring agencies, mine included, to push out, to show what is your implementation plan, right? Is asking you to put together your implementation plans, also asking you for your communication strategy. And I think having a tool that requires you, I mean, like I said, MCC, that's our bread and butter, is outreach to diaspora. I don't know how many agencies probably think of diaspora on a daily basis. We think that's what we do. So having something like that is requiring a lot of agencies to make sure that diaspora is part of that engagement strategy in terms of your Africa strategy, I think is a very important part. You may have other, I won't go into agencies, but there may be agencies who don't think of diaspora on a daily basis. And so having that be one of those sort of tick boxes, I think is critical. And on a personal level, I will say that Mel does a tremendous job, and it's forums like this, I feel that helps sort of ground us. I didn't know that there was a congressional association that focused on diaspora, and so you do feel like you're toiling alone in your own little space. And as I mentioned, we come to the table with a lot of our experiences. I was born here, but I grew up in Africa. I came back here for high school, so I'm one of those people who sort of straddle both continents. But you know the opportunities. You certainly know the opportunity. You know the challenge. You know the dialogue. You know what can be done. I sit there with the CEO. We talk to African leaders. I know what they're bringing to the table. And you're right, in terms of strategy, what African countries need to bring to the table in terms of strategy. So having that dialogue with other diaspora professionals, I think, within the foreign policy arena would be great, not only in strategizing for a better more cohesive sort of strategy among ourselves, but I think it helps for us to sort of talk about our own challenges and figure out how we can also grow as individuals. So this is a very, very great forum. Thank you.
Thank you,
Steve, before you close, I want to say that one of our special guests this year is a group called the Director for Technical Cooperation in Africa. They do capacity development in Africa. And the acting General Secretary is here. Can you stand up, sir? Shabuga Suleiman, coming from Abuja, and we have also the African Capacity Building Foundation, who are with us there at the other forum. But my point is, we actually sitting down talking about how this diaspora can directly impact on development in Africa. His reason for coming is to have these direct kind of conversations about it. So this is where, again, the diaspora is actually building the direct links with institutions working on the ground on the continent.
Okay, thank you, Mel. Well, I'm not going to close yet because I also had another oversight. Elise, bring the microphone down front, because I want our two very distinguished community leaders to have one last moment of comment if they desire.
This is a response to the question about assignments. I'd love you. And I've got one, and it really reflects the last point that I made around this threat to stability in nascent democracies on the continent. The unemployment rate among young men in their mid-20s down the floor is 35%. you can't have stable countries with that level of unemployment. And one of the things that we could add to our arsenal in terms of the programmatic mix of the United States, which helps both our interest as well as Africa's interest, is a democracy stabilization fund. The purpose of which is to plan, empower, and equip nascent democracies on the continent to come up with effective strategies for engaging this huge number of unemployed young men.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Garvey, you have the last word, should you so desire.
I don't really have a great deal to add. I think everything has been said. I will echo some of what Mel said, since we were sort of discussing it over lunch. The diaspora, we need unity among ourselves. Therefore, we must have dialogue. Out of the dialogue, of course, will come communication. But we do need that think tank that Mel talked about, because these issues are very, very complex. The world is a very complex place. It's not enough to simply take the moral high ground and say, oh, we are poor, or we need this, or, good people will look after us, or any of the other platitudes. It's important that we look after ourselves. In order to do that, we have to be intelligent in terms of making intelligent decisions. We have to analyze what the problems are and how we relate to those problems. And all of that takes effort, it takes commitment, it takes organization. So far, I heard only one person that says they're willing to partake in a mission. I think Mel is ready. I know I am ready. And so I think we need a lot of people to sign up for the think tank and for the organizational structure that is going to make the diaspora really, really productive in helping the renaissance of Africa in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garvey, and thank you, the whole panel. Thank you very much for coming.
Good job. You learned a lot this stuff, huh?
Of course.
Thanks for
God bless
hosting
you.
this.
Thank you.
Great meeting you.
It's always good seeing you.
Hope we'll have the opportunity to work together again.
Yes, that would be great. That would be
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It was focused.
Okay, Moon, thank you. You did a very good job.
Yeah, excellent form.
And one reason why I was trying to have you is
Yes, no, this is good to know.
I was coming.